Okay. Welcome everyone to journey through the books of the prophets. We're in the second book of Kings. Tonight we are going to be dedicating the class. Wendy is here, Wendy Fielding, and it's her mother's yurtzeit, Chana Devora Bat Baruch Zev. So our learning tonight should be an Aliyat Neshama for Wendy's mother. When we finish the class, the beginning of the discussion will give Wendy a chance to say a few words about her mother, but our learning tonight is dedicated to Wendy's mother for her yurtzeit. We are in the middle of chapter 18 of the second book of Kings. We began the story of Chezkiyahu. Chezkiyahu, he's described as one of the greatest kings, if not the greatest king. And we even had a question, even greater than David. So one of the verses implies that even in a certain way, even greater than David. The other verse is not quite. David was in a class of his own, especially his relationship with God. And so we began the story with Chizkiyahu. And during his reign, the Assyrians came and took away the 10 tribes, or most of them, to Assyria. We discussed at length what happened to the 10 tribes and even the implications today for what remains of the 10 tribes and all that goes with it. Here we're picking up where the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, so he is now going to attack Yehuda. He's already taken the 10 tribes away from the northern kingdom, and he's brought in foreign peoples to live there. And now he's turned his focus to destroy Yehuda and take Yerushalayim. And so where we ended last class is Chezkiyahu gave him an enormous amount of money to try to pay him off not to attack, including, and either this week or next week we'll discuss this further, he took 2 of the doors of the temple, and obviously they were worth a lot of money, and he gave them to Sennacherib. And we'll see something that the sages said about that. And that's where we pick up here. We pick up where, even though he's been paid all of this money, all this ransom money, Sennacherib is now coming against Yehuda. And for all practical purposes, had he been successful, it could have been the end of the Jewish people. 10 of the 12 tribes were taken already. And if he would have defeated Yehuda and taken Yerushalayim, there's reason to believe that the Jewish people would just slowly cease to exist. So it was really a fight for the existence of Israel as a people. And so he sends, Sennacherib sends his generals, and we're picking up in the 17th verse of the 18th chapter. As always, we cannot go over every detail, but in short, these representatives of Sennacherib, so they're sending messages to Chizkiyahu, and they're sending messages to the people kind of asking, do you really think that Chizkiyahu is going to save you? Do you really think that God is going to save you? Sennacherib has been conquering every place that he goes. Why do you think that you're going to be different? And so there's a whole dialogue going back and forth, but these representatives are in a certain way mocking the Jewish people for even thinking that they're going to be saved from Sennacherib. And it would be better just to give them the keys to the city and call it quits. So this is a good part of the end of chapter 18. And so the representatives of Chizkiyahu come back to him and tell him, like, this is their attitude. They have not been bought off by the money. They're determined to take Yehuda and Yerushalayim. And towards the end of chapter 18, it says that the people who are hearing, at one point, this one representative, he's talking in the language that the people understood. And so all the people, like on the wall of the city, who are witnessing this warning, they are despondent. What are we going to do here? And so they come back to Chizkiyahu, the beginning of chapter 19. And Chizkiyahu, he ripped his clothing, which is a sign of mourning. It was like the situation was so dire. And there's actually a halacha that when we hear of one of the 7 close relatives that we officially mourn over, we literally make a cut in our garment. But that extends also when very, very bad news comes that affects the whole Jewish people. There's also this idea of, it's called tearing kriya, of making this tear. And so Chizkiyahu tore his clothes. This is one of the actual textual supports for this law. And so he rent his clothes, he put on sackcloth, and he went up to the temple, and he's davening, he's praying. And Chizkiyahu says that this is a day of trouble, a day of reviling and blasphemy. And so he sends for the prophet Yeshayahu. Now, this is very significant because we know the next book after the book of Kings is the book of Yeshayahu, Isaiah. And it's discussed among the sages, but Isaiah was considered the second greatest of all of the prophets, second only to Moshe Rabbeinu. But this is the first time he appears. He hasn't appeared in the Tanakh yet. His book comes next, but here he is appearing for the first time. And Chizkiyahu sends a message for him to come. And Yeshayahu is told what the situation is. And he tells the messengers to tell Chizkiyahu, God will save you. Don't be totally despondent, that God will take care of Sennacherib and he will save you. And so And so Chizkiyahu again goes up to the temple, and here in the middle of chapter 19, there's actually the record of his prayer. And he says like this. I'll read it. Vayit palel Chizkiyahu lifnei Hashem. And Chizkiyahu prayed before Hashem. V'yomar Hashem Elokei Yisrael, God, the God of Israel. Yoshev HaKruvim, the one who sits on the Kruvim, these types of angels. Atahu Elokim levadecha, you are the only God. L'chol mamlachot haaretz, of all of the kingdoms of the earth, you're really the only sovereign. You made heaven and you made earth. And then there's a verse that's actually included in the Yom Kippur prayers. Az necha v'shama pekach Hashem einecha u're'eh u'shma et divrei, up to there. In other words, please hear and open your ears, God, and open your eyes and see and hear. So these words are actually included in the Yom Kippur prayers. And he prays that God will save them from Sennacherib. As I said, we have to understand the historical context here. This is quite literally a fight for survival of the Jewish people. It's happening right here. If God wouldn't have saved them, in theory, just like so many peoples have disappeared from the face of the earth, the Jewish people could have gone the same way. And he continues his prayer, and he beseeches God to save them. And then Yeshayahu sends a message to Chizkiyahu. Isaiah sends a message and says, in the name of God, that God has heard your prayer. And then the rest of chapter 19, Isaiah goes into very poetic description of what God thinks of Sennacherib and what God thinks of the Jewish people, and that you can be assured that God will not hand over the city to Sennacherib, and eventually he will drive Sennacherib out of Yehuda, and he'll go scampering home. And then at the end of chapter 19, so this is considered one of the greatest miracles in Jewish history about what is about to happen. And so it says in the 35th verse, it says that night, an angel of God went out into the camp. Now remember, Jerusalem is surrounded. There's a siege, totally surrounded by a huge army. Here it says 185,000 soldiers. And I just read today that it's estimated that there were no more than 10,000 Jews in Jerusalem at the time. Perhaps it was a little bit more, but it was an overwhelming army had laid siege to Jerusalem. And an angel of God went out, and here there's no description of exactly what happened, but what it says is that in the morning, this is the angel struck down the entire army. And so it says in the morning, when the Jews got up, the entire camp of Assyria were dead. Sennacherib was still alive. When he saw what had just happened, it's assumed it was some kind of a plague. We don't really have a total description, but somehow, like I said, this is one of the greatest miracles in Jewish history, that this enormous army they woke up in the morning and they were all dead. And so Sennacherib goes back to Assyria, and he went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh, if you remember from the story of Jonah, Jonah was sent a message to Nineveh that in 3 days, Nineveh will be overturned. Nineveh was like the capital of Assyria at that time. And this is not the time to go into the whole story of Jonah, but we know that he tried to escape from having to deliver this message. And there's a whole question, like, why was he escaping? Why didn't he want to bring the message? And because he later explains in the book of Jonah that Jonah says that he knows that God is a merciful God. And the people at that time did tshuva, and God didn't overturn Nineveh. And Jonah was totally perplexed. The book of Jonah it's actually a very perplexing, paradoxical story. That what Jonah couldn't understand, he was a prophet, and he understood that in the future, these same people from Assyria, from Nineveh, would come and take away the 10 tribes and try to take Jerusalem as well. And he couldn't understand how it could be that God could let them to do tshuva when it was clear in the future all of the trouble that they would cause. So I'm just saying that because here Sennacherib goes back to Nineveh. And then, as we've been discussing for the last few weeks, here mostly it was about the Jewish kings. One after the other was assassinated, either by their children or their servants or their representatives. So here, Sennacherib, his sons killed him, and they took over for him. So it's just another in this whole series of kings being overthrown by their own people, and in many cases, even most cases, by their own children. And that's how chapter 19 ends. Chapter 20 a good part of chapter 20 is about one particular incident, and then a second. There's like 2 incidences in chapter 20. So it begins, B'yamim ahem chalach Chizkiyahu lamut. V'yavo elav Yeshayahu ben Amoz hanavi v'yomer alav. Ko amar Hashem tzab lebeitcha ki met ata v'lo techiyah. So it says, in those days, Chizkiyahu became ill to the point that he was on the threshold of death. And Yeshayahu, the same Isaiah, who sent messages from God to Chizkiyahu that he would save the Jewish people, which he did. And Yeshayahu comes and says that I have a message from God, prepare your house, your household. In other words, give them final instructions, because you will die and you will not live. That's how this incident begins. Now, there's a lot of discussion among the commentaries when this happened. Here, if we're following chronological order, so it happened after this whole miracle and the whole incident with Sennacherib. And yet many of the commentaries, we have this principle called Ein Mukdam V'Muchar B'Torah. There is no before and after in the Torah. Meaning, usually the Torah, the Tanakh, follows a chronological order, but not always. Sometimes certain chapters or verses are taken out of chronological order. It happens in the 5 books of Moses, in the Chumash. It happens in the Tanakh. So many of the commentaries say that this whole sickness happened before the miracle. And it was, as we see from the story, as he's healed, then the miracle happened. Other people say, no, we can understand it in a chronological order. We're going to have to go into depths, because here, if it's in chronological order, we have this simple question. After this great miracle, why is he about to die? Why is Isaiah coming with a message, you will die and you won't live? So there's a lot of questions, but we're going to just approach the story and know that there's different opinions as to when this happened. So he comes with this message, and Chizkiyahu doesn't say anything. It says he turns his face to the wall and he prayed to Hashem. And this is the second one. Already we have a recording of his first prayer. We should know that throughout the Tanakh, many people are praying to God. But many times we don't actually know what they prayed. But here, it's actually recorded exactly what they prayed. And he says here, it's interesting because when Moshe is praying to come into Israel, we're told that he prayed 515 prayers to come into Israel. The whole incident happens in Parshat Ve'et Hanan in the book of Deuteronomy. And Ve'et Hanan is Gematria 515. And it means that Moshe pleaded with God to come into the land. And because the numerical value of the word Ve'et Hanan is 515, they learned that he prayed 515 times to come into the land. But Rashi points out that the way that Moshe prayed is he was asking for a matanat chinam, a pure gift of mercy, that he didn't say to God, God, look how much I did for you. I dedicated my whole life to following you and to doing your will. So now I need you to do what I'm asking you. Let me come into Israel. Rashi says he did not do this. He prayed for what's called a matanat chinam, a free gift, a gift of mercy. But here we see that Chizkiyahu takes a different way of praying. And he does mention everything that I've done to try to do your will in this world. So therefore, why are you cutting my life short? Let me live. And so that's in essence what he says. He says, I beseech you, God, remember now how I have walked before you in truth and a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in your sight. And then it says, Chizkiyahu wept bitterly. He wanted to live. And he wanted to, but here he wanted to live because he had such a belief in not only God, but belief that he was doing God's will in the world. It wasn't an egotistical, like, look what everything I've done for you. Now you need to pay up. No, he was just declaring, I've done everything for you because of my love for you, my belief in you. And so please let me live. And it says that he cried bitterly. And so Yeshayahu had already left. He came, he delivered his message, instruct your household because you're going to die. So it's not even clear that he was there when Chizkiyahu was praying. And I should mention one thing, that we know that, like I mentioned before, when Chizkiyahu tore his garment, that it's a fascinating thing that we look at the text and we see the basis of Jewish law. So the fact that he tore his garment when he heard this terrible news that Sennacherib was determined to take Yehuda and Yerushalayim, so he tore his clothes, and that's a textual support. But here it says, why do we have to know that he turned his face towards the wall? And so it's mentioned in Jewish law. Now, not everyone can do this because of, call it, spatial reality. But if one has a choice as where to pray, we're told it's good to pray in front of some here is a wall. And that's why you'll see many times in a Beit Knesset that the front wall, many people want to daven right there because of this story. Because as we're going to see, Isaiah had left, and God comes to Isaiah and said, return to Chizkiyahu and tell him I have heard his prayer. And part of that prayer really is that he cried bitterly. And we have a teaching that once the temple was destroyed, all the gates of prayer have been shut up symbolically. In a certain way, we don't really believe that. We believe that the gates of prayer are always open. But as an emphasis on the importance of the temple, there is a teaching that when the temple was destroyed, it was as if all of the gates of prayer were closed, except the gate of tears. And so here again, we see in this story a basis of that kind of idea that was later given over by the sages. And so Yeshayahu comes back and he says, turn back and tell Chizkiyahu, the prince of my people. So obviously God loved Chizkiyahu, but we're going to have to see why was he sick and about to die? And as I said, the message was, in God's name, God has heard your prayer, and I have seen your tears, and I will heal you on the third day. On the third day. And he says, and I will add to your life 15 years. one second. And now here, this is one of the proofs that this whole incident happened before. And that's, in a certain way, the majority opinion, because then it says, and I will deliver you and the city out of the hand of the king of Ashur. And I will defend the city for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So here, it's almost clear that this whole incident happened right before the great miracle of the saving of the city of Yerushalayim. So here I just want to point out that this comes up many, many, many times. Sometimes I pointed it out and many times I haven't. But when God shows, let's say, his anger at the Jewish people for their turning away from him and worshiping idols and not being moral, not being ethical. But many times, though, God ends it by saying, but I will always save a remnant. And sometimes it says, because of my love for the patriarchs, Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And sometimes, especially when it talks about Jerusalem, for the sake of David. That God had a very special relationship with the three patriarchs and David. That's why these four are considered the four legs of the divine throne. Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and David. So, one second. And so, this is also interesting, right after Tu B'Shvat. So, it says that Yeshayahu told Chizkiyahu, take a cake of figs, meaning not just one fig, a whole, in Hebrew it's called a gush, a whole packet of figs. And apparently whatever he was suffering from was coming from some kind of festering boil or some eruption in his skin. And Yeshayahu said, take the figs and put it on the festering place, and he was healed. And what's interesting, I think I've mentioned that when we're talking about Tu B'Shvat, that I used to have this enormous fig tree growing out of a cave right by my front door. And this is going back 40, 50 years, that a number of people in my family had warts. We're not sure where it was coming from, but a number of us had them. And we heard that a natural remedy for warts was to pick a fig. And when you pick a fig, there is this white sap, very sticky. And we were told to put that on the warts and it would get rid of them. And it did. And so here, this is so interesting because that's how he was healed. That somehow this white sap of the fig has the ability, has the characteristic to draw out poison or whatever was causing the warts, whatever was causing this festering wound that he had, to pull it out of the body. Okay, and that more or less ends this incident. So the question is, what's going on between the lines here? Why is Yeshayahu sick? So one of the explanations, and it's very connected to what I talked about Jonah, even though I try to explain a very, very complex issue in just a few sentences. But Jonah was totally perplexed of why God would allow Nineveh to repent. In other words, if they wouldn't have repented, then the city might have been overthrown. Like many prophecies, it ultimately is not written in stone. It depends how people react. And that's why all of the prophets who warned the people that their way of living, their turning away from God, their idol worship, their lack of morals and ethics was going to lead to the destruction of the temple and the exile. But it didn't have to happen. If the people would have changed, then it wouldn't have happened. The same thing with Jonah. But they did do tshuva in the moment. That's one of the reasons that why we read it on Yom Kippur, is because we're told that God judges us where we're holding at the moment. And even though God knows what the future is going to bring, that, well, the future in a certain way can change also, because that's also dependent on human agency. And here we have a similar idea with Chizkiyahu. So the teaching from the sages is, what was the underlying problem here? And so it's told that at that point, Chizkiyahu was not married. He's been king for quite a while. He's not a youngster anymore. He only started being a king when he was 25 years old. And he's not married. And there's a whole discussion between him and Isaiah between the lines here that we know from the oral Torah. And that is when Isaiah confronts him, like, you need to get married. So Chizkiyahu says, I know either from prophecy or divine inspiration that if I get married, that my son is going to be a very, very evil king. And therefore, I don't want to get married, and I don't want to bring this soul into the world. So here it's perplexing, because the first mitzvah of the Torah is be fruitful and multiply. And it's called mitzvah rabbah. It's like considered a great mitzvah. And here, Chizkiyahu doesn't want to get married, but at least in his mind, he has a very good reason, is that he can see clearly that, and this is also perplexing, and we've seen this over and over and over again, where evil kings give birth to the king that follows, who becomes righteous, and righteous kings who have sons who are evil and become evil kings. These are things that are truthfully beyond our ability to understand. And that's what Isaiah answers Chizkiyahu. Again, with a very, very kind of like mysterious answer. He doesn't say, no, you're not going to have an evil son. We're going to see, we won't get to it today, but the son of Chizkiyahu is one of the most evil kings in all of Jewish history. So Chizkiyahu saw correctly, but Isaiah said to him, this is God's purview. This is not for you to not get married and have children because of this, we call it quasi prophecy. Your job is to do the mitzvot. And it's a Jewish mitzvah to get married and to have children. What happens after that, this is for God to deal with. So it's very perplexing. So what happened? So Chizkiyahu marries the daughter of Isaiah, and they have Manasseh. And we'll see in probably next week. Manasseh ruled for 55 years, and he was one of the most evil kings in all of Jewish history. So the ways of God are truly mysterious. And this particular oral Torah really points that out. So obviously, this whole story needs a lot of thought. But I want to continue with the next incident at the end of chapter 20. And that is the king of Bavel hears that Chizkiyahu was sick. And so he sends one second. He sends a letter like Refuah Shlema, hope you get better. And he sent gifts and presents. And so when these messengers come with all these presents and everything, so it says that he opened up the whole kingdom's treasury, and he was very proud. He was very proud of how strong Israel was at the time. He was very proud of how many riches that they had. And he opened up the temple to them, which is okay because a non-Jew is allowed to come to the temple. It's encouraged to come to the temple. But it says that he even opened up the Holy of Holies. And some say he even opened the ark so they could see the 2 tablets of the law. And God was not happy with this. He felt this was totally irresponsible and just not the right thing to do. And it was coming from a certain pride or arrogance that had slipped into Chizkiyahu's personality. So here comes Isaiah again, and Isaiah tells him, now obviously this must be after 15 years because God told him he would have another 15 years. And he says again, mysteriously, the same Babylonia, that you just showed all of your riches to everything. Well, you know what? They're going to come one day and take them all and take the rest of Yehuda and the whatever tribes escaped to Yehuda and Binyamin into exile. But it won't happen during your days because there was a certain honor that God gave to Chizkiyahu of all the years that he did serve him loyally. But this is what's going to happen. Like, you have no idea what you did here. Symbolically, by showing them all of the riches, you're just like feeding their ultimate desire that all these riches should be theirs. And the end of chapter 20 is, as almost all of these kings, again, I haven't emphasized this, but almost at the end of every king, whether he was good or evil, it almost all ends the same way, that the rest of the acts of here Chizkiyahu, but all the other kings, aren't they written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Yehuda? So it means the book of Kings, and it also means the book of Chronicles. And then it says that Chizkiyahu slept with his fathers. In other words, he passed away. Usually it would say, and he was buried in the city of David. Here it doesn't say that. It just says he slept with his fathers. And Menashe, his son, reigned after him. So that concludes the story of Chizkiyahu. So here I want to fill in some of the missing gaps, and especially from different teachings we have in the Talmud about Chizkiyahu. So again, Chizkiyahu is considered one of the greatest kings. But as we see, even Moshe Rabbeinu, he hit the rock instead of speaking to it, and it was decreed that he couldn't come into Israel. So we see the greatest of the great, David, had so many problems during his life. And here we see Chizkiyahu, that no matter how great, all of these people are human, they all make mistakes, and they all pay for their mistakes. So nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the greatness of Chizkiyahu. So I want to give over some of the teachings from the Talmud about him. So first of all, I don't know if I mentioned, but he was the 13th king in the line of David. All the kings are from David. He's the 13th in the series of kings. And it's not mentioned who his wife is in the context of who his wife is, but it's mentioned who the one second. It is his wife is Hephzibah, which means that my desire is in her. It's a very, very beautiful name, Hephzibah. So one of the things it says in the Gemara, again, Chizkiyahu's father, Achaz, terribly evil king. And so this is one thing that we have to realize about Chizkiyahu that we haven't mentioned. And that is, in a certain way, he was a Baal Tshuva. David, his father, was one of the greatest tzaddikim of the generation, Yishai. But here we see that Chizkiyahu's father was terrible evil. So he was brought up in a house of idol worship with no regard for the Torah. The text doesn't explain, well, how did he end up being such a righteous king? How did he end up being such a righteous king? We don't know exactly, but obviously something happened in his life and he became a Baal Tshuva. So it says that when Achaz, his father, was king, one of the idol worships that is mentioned in the Torah a number of times in the 5 books in the Chumash is that one of the religions of the Canaanite nations was Moloch. And part of serving Moloch was to make children pass through the fire. There was child sacrifice. And this was considered one of the worst of all of the idol worship. And it's mentioned many times. Achaz tried to send Chizkiyahu. He wanted to sacrifice him. But it says that his mother saved him And how did she save him? She put the blood of the salamandra on him, and somehow he was passed through the fire, but it somehow it saved him. There's a whole discussion. What exactly was this creature, the salamander? It sounds like a salamander, but it's not clear it was a salamander. Some even say it was a special animal that was created only to save Chizkiyahu. But there's a debate which kind of animal it could have been. But here the point is, anyone who wants to look this up, it's in Sanhedrin 63b, this whole story. But here we see that Chizkiyahu was being set up to be an evil king also. He wasn't raised in Torah. And yet he became one of the most righteous kings, and he got rid of all of the idol worships in Israel. He totally eradicated, at least in his generation, all of the idol worship. A second story says, this is in Bava Batra in 15a. There's a whole fascinating discussion as to who wrote all of the books of the Tanakh. Now, we would think it's obvious. Whoever the book is named after, that's who wrote them. But what's interesting is it's not completely true. We're not going to go into discussing all the different books, but it says explicitly that Chizkiyahu and his associates wrote the book of Isaiah and all three books that are attributed to Solomon, to Shlomo HaMelech. So the question is, how can that be? We have a clear tradition that Shlomo HaMelech wrote Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and Proverbs, Kohelet, Shir HaShirim, and Mishlei. How could they say that Chizkiyahu and his associates wrote it? So what's understood, what's explained in the book of Isaiah? Well, the book of Isaiah, it's recorded what Isaiah said to the people, the prophecies. So the way we understand this is something that follows through much of Jewish tradition. Shlomo HaMelech did write those three books. Yeshayahu did write his books, but we're told that they were the final, call it codification, the summation. There might have been scrolls with different parts of Proverbs, and they just put it together. And so that's how we understand it. So they're both true. In other words, Chizkiyahu and associates, they put we'll call it the final touchings on these four books: Isaiah, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Proverbs. So now we see even how great Chizkiyahu was. These books are four of the books of the Tanakh, and that he had an intrinsic, essential part that we have these books today. Now, when I mentioned that this is something that has happened throughout Jewish history, I'm just going to bring a few examples. That the last chapter of Sefer Yetzirah, which is considered the first real text of Kabbalah, of the Jewish mystic tradition, it's attributed to none other than Avram, explicitly. And yet, we're told that it wasn't finally codified to almost 1,700 years later. It was an oral tradition. So we have no idea really what the oral tradition means. That people were able to contain enormous amounts of oral tradition without computers, without email, without WhatsApp, without AI. And so the tradition of Sefer Yetzirah comes from Avram Avinu. But it doesn't mean that every word that we find in the versions that we have today necessarily came from Avram Avinu. We have the same idea with the Zohar. The Zohar wasn't revealed until approximately 1,200 years after Shimon Bar Yochai, 1,100 years after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is attributed to be the author. And so modern scholars or Bible critics will say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had nothing to do with the Zohar. That's not our belief. Our belief is that the traditions that are revealed in the Zohar came from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his contemporaries, but they weren't written down, codified in the way that we have it now. And the last thing I'll mention is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written down in 200 CE, which is 1,500 years after Har Sinai. And sometimes we use the word Yehuda Hanasi wrote the Mishnah, but that's not the right verb. He compiled the Mishnah. These were oral traditions handed down literally for 1,500 years, but he had the genius because he knew that without it being written down, it could be forgotten. So he compiled it, but he didn't make up any of the oral traditions. He was just the compiler. So that's just important to know when we say that Chizkiyahu wrote the book of these 4 books that we mentioned. And I'll just mention, because we haven't said it, who wrote the book of Kings? It's not mentioned. It's not mentioned anywhere in the text who wrote it. In this Talmud, Baba Batra, Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the author, the compiler, the editor of the book of Kings. Now, it's getting late here, but I'm going to try to get a little bit more done here. And that is in Psachim 56a. Very fascinating. It says that Chizkiyahu did 6 things without asking the sages, without asking the Sanhedrin, the elders, the rabbis of the time. He did 6 things on his own, it was called dat, and his own knowledge. And it says 3 of them the rabbis approved of, and 3 of them they did not approve. What are the 3 that they approved of? It says that when Chizkiyahu became king, he became king when his father died. And it's clear already that he had chosen the path of Torah. Most likely he wasn't able to really manifest that as long as his father was alive. But when his father died, instead of giving him a proper burial, he put him on like this like mat and dragged the body through the city as a way of showing that just like my father disrespected the Torah, I'm going to disrespect him in his time of burial. And the rabbis approved. It was an unusual thing that they would approve, but that's how evil Achaz was. Then we already learned this, that he destroyed the copper serpent that Moshe had made because people were starting to worship it. And so he destroyed it, even though Moshe made it at the instruction of God. But nonetheless, it was turning into a source of idol worship. So the sages agreed. And there was a book of healing that was handed down to Chizkiyahu. According to tradition, it was compiled by Shlomo Melech. He was an expert in all what we'll call naturopathy, in all of the herbs, all of the fruits and the trees, and he knew their healing properties. And apparently this book of healing was so efficient, worked so well, that people forgot to pray for healing. Oh, we just look in the book and we do whatever it says. And the whole idea of in Jewish thought, if someone is sick, it's supposed to be a way to alert them that either their lifestyle that they're living is an unhealthy lifestyle, or the spiritual life that they're leading is faulty and it needs to be fixed. And so people like kind of forgot about that. It's just to get sick, just go to the book of Refuah and I'll get better. And I don't have to understand what the reason I got sick in the first place. So it says that Chizkiyahu destroyed the book. And the sages agreed. They said that it wasn't a play on words. It wasn't a healthy situation. Then there were three things that they didn't agree with. One, as we mentioned a couple of times, that when Sennacherib first was laying siege or threatening to lay siege, that Chizkiyahu tried to buy him off, and he gave two of the doors from the temple. And the sages said that wasn't a good move. That wasn't the proper thing to do with something from the temple. So they didn't agree with that. When Sennacherib was starting his siege, we didn't mention that one of the greatest contributions of Chizkiyahu was the original water source of the city of David was outside the walls of the city. And Chizkiyahu understood this is militarily, this is a terrible thing, because any army that comes to lay siege will have our water source. And so he created the whole way of bringing water into the city of Jerusalem, so it could not be cut off by the enemy. And there are still remains of it in the city of David today. These are some of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the last 100 years, are these tunnels that are bringing the Gihon spring into the city of Jerusalem. But here, what he did was he cut off the water because he believed that would make the army go away. But it also took away the source of water for the people in Jerusalem. And so the sages didn't agree with it, because Isaiah had already come and promised that Jerusalem wouldn't be destroyed, and Chizkiyahu should have depended on trust that God would save them. And the third thing was, and this we don't have time to go into, but in the second book of Chronicles, the 30th chapter, I mentioned this before, that to get the full story of many of the things that happen in the book of Kings, one has to go to the book of Chronicles. A lot of it is repetitious, but a lot of it adds new insight. And so the third thing that the rabbis didn't agree to is not mentioned in the book of Kings at all, but it is mentioned in the second book of Chronicles. And that is, apparently, for many generations, Pesach was not being kept. The Korban Pesach wasn't being offered, and simply people were involved in their idol worship. People were just far away from Torah, and people were not, I'm not saying everyone, but the vast majority of people were not keeping Pesach. Chizkiyahu is now king, and one of the first things he wants to do is reestablish Pesach. How can we not have Pesach? So the whole 30th chapter of the book of Chronicles it's a beautiful, beautiful story of how he restored Pesach to the Jewish people. But the way he did it was, when it came time to restore Pesach, it was already the month of Nisan. And many of the people were impure. You could not offer the Korban Pesach if you were in a state of ritual impurity. And certainly the Kohanim and the Leviim could not do the service of preparing the Korban Pesach. And it was already Nisan. And so we know today, now this is way before there was a calendar. This is when the Sanhedrin had to establish the new moon every month by witnesses. And in order to keep Pesach in the spring, because the lunar calendar, which is a Jewish calendar, is 11 days shorter than a solar calendar. And it says in the Torah 3 different times, Pesach must be in the spring. Well, of course it has to be in the spring. That's when Pesach is. But what it's telling us, if we went solely by a lunar calendar, that wouldn't be true, because every year is 11 days shorter. And so Pesach would start coming out 11 days earlier every year. So in 3 years, Pesach would end up not being in Nisan. It would end up being in the previous month of Adar. And so 7 times in 19 years, we add a leap month in order to keep the solar calendar and the lunar calendar in sync, so Pesach could be in the spring. But the added month is always the second Adar, the last month of the year. But it was already Nisan. And so Chizkiyahu, on his own initiative, added a second month of Nisan. And so that Pesach that he reestablished, which was a tremendous thing that Chizkiyahu did, was a second Nisan that had never happened before or since. And the rabbis didn't agree that he did such a thing. So that's just a review of different things. So I'm leaving one more for next week, and that has to do with Chizkiyahu and Mashiach. So I'm whetting your appetite. This is really, really an important one. What's the connection between Chizkiyahu and Mashiach? And that we'll get to next week. I just want to remind everyone that our learning tonight, and we'll hear from Wendy in a few minutes, is Wendy's mother, Chana Devorah Bat Baruch Zev. Our learning tonight is dedicated for an Aliyat Neshama, and may this learning help elevate her soul.